Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning on this beautiful Friday morning. It is absolutely gorgeous weather out there, so we appreciate you taking some time to join us. We're going to have a great conversation today regarding food and beverage. Most of you that are on the call this morning likely have some sort of either a cafe to a restaurant situation at your association. And myself, Fiona DiDomenico from Castle. We've got Jason Salter from Castle, and then our guest, Steve Adamczyk. So thank you for joining us this morning. Shauna, if you want to go to the next slide. We're going to have a discussion regarding opening up your facility, specifically as it relates to food and beverage. One of the things that Castle has done is we have prepared and many of you may have already seen our plan to, close down the facilities and what to do and all the different COVID situations that have come up. We've all had to become somewhat experts in the COVID world. And so now we've also put together kind of a game plan on reopening both your facilities and your food and beverage areas. So anyone who would like information on that, feel free to reach out to us at info@castlegroup.com. and we'll be able to forward that on to you. We want this morning's presentation to be kind of a discussion, so we have received a few questions already. And as Shauna mentioned, just remember you can go to the bottom of your screen and you can type in a question, and I'll be monitoring those as we go this morning. And Jason and Steve will be happy to kind of walk you through and answer those questions. Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you quickly. If you can just kind of introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about what you do for us with Castle, and then you can turn it over to Steve.
Sure. Jason Salter, Director of Food and Beverage. Hi, everybody. I've been around since September. My background is all food and beverage. I'm the bagel guy. I don't know a whole lot about property management, but I'm learning fast. So I've been in operations my entire career. Most recently, I spent about 5.5 years as a regional director with Panera Bread. But I've run everything from fast food to fine dining. So I've got information and knowledge about pretty much every capacity of food and beverage that you may have. And we're busy writing manuals and reopening policies. And we're working fast and fluid like everybody else. And it's been a lot of fun, and I'm happy to be here. With that, I'll turn it over to Steve Adamczyk. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too bad. I think I just learned how to say it correctly this morning, and let him tell you a little bit about himself.
No, that's just right, Jason. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Adamczyk. I'm one of the shareholders with Godey Adamczyk, DeBost, and Cross. I'm in Naples, but we have 5 offices across Florida. We represent a lot of condos and HOAs, and a lot of those associations have food and beverage programs. So we've obviously been living this COVID-19 just like everyone else the last couple of weeks. And so we've learned a lot as we've been working through this pandemic, and really appreciate the opportunity to address you all today and answer questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve. Fiona, would you like me to go through the agenda?
Sure, that'd be great. Thanks, Jason.
Okay. Just to lay some foundation on the call, it's going to be mostly centered around food and beverage, although I know that there's a few questions out there about some other amenities, and we'll address those as well. But the first thing is to be safe, to be smart, and do things step by step. There's a lot of questions we see about phasing in. Well, we phased out and we'll phase back in, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about emergency powers, which is probably more in Steve's wheelhouse. Signage and waivers, which we'll all address. Reorders for food, that's a big deal. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on that and show you how to do this efficiently and cost effective as well. And then hygiene and cleaning, which is the 500-pound gorilla in the room, and we're going to address that as well.
So Shauna, if you could take us to the next slide. Perfect. And Steve, I think this is you.
Sure. So we all know that the governor has been issuing new orders every day almost related to COVID-19. And the most recent one that's really impacting everyone is the safe, smart, step-by-step phased in recovery. So it's effective May 4th. This replaced what was a number of different smaller emergency orders throughout the months of March and April. The original order of declaration of emergency was March 9, I believe. And we'll talk more about that in the next section. But ultimately, we had the original restaurant limitation on occupancy and serving. Then we had the gyms. Then we had, obviously, vacation rentals. Then we had a number of different, more restrictive orders as we went through those couple weeks there. And now we have this phase 1 of the reopening, which is effective Monday. And we really have not seen any new orders coming out. I just checked the website a couple minutes ago. I haven't seen any new updated orders by the governor in the last couple of days, other than extending some emergency appointments. And so this is the world that we're living in right now. And so Jason's going to be talking about the nuts and bolts about how we actually are able to implement some of these occupancy restrictions, some of these alcohol sales issues that have been changing over the last couple of weeks. And also knowing that we have some publications out there, whether it's from the FDA, National Restaurant Association, Florida Restaurant Lodging Association. And the question is, how do we safely reopen now that the governor has opened the door for this to happen with this May 4th phased in first phase recovery process?
Great, and we actually have a question on that note, Steve, if I can interrupt for a second.
Sure.
This comes from George, and he says, we're an HOA that has a bar/restaurant that typically is open to the public, although the percentage of revenue from the public is minimal. If we reopen it, should we or must we open it to the public, or can it be just to owners and their guests?
So it's a great question. Yeah, it's really going to tie into the emergency powers on the next slide. But if we assume that the association has emergency powers, we'll talk more about that in detail. The emergency powers allow the association, when recommended by a licensed professional or by the government, to declare certain portions of the property off limits to owners, tenants, guests, invitees, licensees, vendors, whoever you want. So assuming that these powers exist, and I do believe they do, we'll talk more about that in a minute, but if those powers do exist, then you could dictate who is able to come into the restaurant facility and limit non-owners, non-residents, non-tenants for a time being. And yes, that would be permissible under the emergency powers as stated today.
And that's really, I think, similar, Steve. We've had a lot of associations, for example, have a big, huge, clubhouse with a beautiful pool, et cetera. And I know a lot of our associations have said, we're going to open the pool back up, but it's limited to who can use it. And in that sort of similar example, a lot of the associations are saying, guests are not allowed. It's just for the residents at this point. So sounds like similar for the restaurant, similar kind of thought process.
Yep, I played tennis last night in my own community, and the sign up front said residents only. So
yeah.
We're all living it.
How did you do?
As the first time in 2.5 years, so it was a little rough. It was a little rough. I tore some shoulder stuff, so I was just getting back.
Oh no. Okay. All right. Do we want anything else? Okay, perfect, Shauna. Thank you. So here's your emergency powers, Steve. I think that's a perfect segue.
Great. So whether you're in 718, 719, or 720 for condos, HOAs, or co-ops, the statutes provide for emergency powers. So we know that these were originally opened. The door was opened on March 9, I believe, when the governor issued the first emergency declaration. The statute says that you can exercise these powers in response to a declaration of emergency issued by the governor. It sends you to a statute which specifically talks about the governor. And there's a laundry list of powers. Now, this statute was originally drafted with the intention of applying to hurricane damage and allowing boards to make immediate action, whether it's in terms of borrowing, whether it's in terms of deeming certain portions of the property off limits, whether it's special assessing without board or owner approval. And it allows the board to do this. Now, the very last paragraph of all these statutes provide that these powers last for so long as reasonably necessary for the preservation of health, safety, and welfare. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because the initial 60-day order on the emergency declaration expires today. Right? Today is the 60th day. And so there's a question out there in the legal community as to whether or not the emergency powers continue to be available if the governor allows the 60-day window to expire today. And we believe that it does, even if the window expires, because that last paragraph, which says these powers last as long as reasonably necessary for the preservation of health, safety, and welfare. Now, we also anticipate that the governor will extend the order. And the reason is because we just talked about phase 1 of this coming back to normal work life. Well, how does the governor get to implement those powers? And how does he get to implement phase 2 or phase 3? If he doesn't have emergency powers himself, if he doesn't declare a state of emergency. So we are anticipating that those powers will be extended, but it's a little bit of a wait and see there. But irrespective, we believe that the ability to exercise those powers exists today and tomorrow, even if the extension is not granted, because it is, I think most people would agree, still reasonably necessary for the protection of health, safety, and welfare. There's no measuring stick as to what percentage of cases come back positive that makes it reasonable. There's no measuring stick that says the number of deaths per day makes it reasonable or no longer reasonable to exercise these powers. But obviously there is some standard out there, and we believe that we're still in it and will be for the short time in the near future. If those powers exist, we just talked about number 2, which is that the statutes provide that you can deem certain portions of the property off limits. Now, we talked about this being intended originally for hurricane damage, and the intention was probably, well, when the engineer tells you you can't walk on that balcony because it's about to collapse, that means you can tell people you can't go walk on the balcony because it's about to collapse. However, the DVPR has said that this emergency power statute is available to coronavirus, that the coronavirus is the type of emergency that they're going to allow these powers to be used for. And so this is the same statute that people are using to say only essential services can come through the gate, or the pinochle crew can't come through today and they have to wait a couple weeks longer. I've learned more about pinochle in the last couple weeks than I ever anticipated because of this epidemic as well. So these are the powers that we allow these boards to say, no moving trucks, no moving vendors coming in to touch all the elevator buttons and the handles and the door handles, and it makes a lot of sense. And so in this context, if you have a restaurant facility, it would allow the board, it wouldn't require the board, but it would allow the board to say that we're only going to allow residents and family members or whatever limit you want to put as being able to attend the restaurant facilities, right? So whether it's pickleball or whether it's the restaurant, this emergency power is what gives you the right to do that. So talking quickly about liquidity. So this is the $1 million question for a lot of people, or maybe a $2 million question if you look at the audit requirements. So this PPP funding and bank loan funding, okay? So a lot of restaurant operations are the closest thing in the HOA world to a profit pursuing enterprise. So yes, you might be subsidizing restaurant operations and maybe heavily, but I imagine the goal is to have revenues in excess of costs, right? Which means profit. And if that's true, then you are probably the closest thing to an eligible entity. Now, there's a whole other discussion as to whether or not you're eligible based on whether you have a management company and they employ employees or whether you have employees directly, and that's a discussion for another day. But ultimately, there are lending sources, and these emergency powers allow the board to borrow without an owner vote if your documents require an owner vote. Not all documents require an owner vote, but if they do, the emergency powers would allow the board to get liquidity. And so whether this is through an attempt of the PPP funding or whether another SBA small business loan with low interest, or whether you got a line of credit you're trying to draw on, or whether you're going to a local bank for private funding sources, then you would not need to have a vote to borrow. So associations are great borrowers. Your repayment rate is exceptionally high. And so banks love lending money to HOAs and condos. And so in this context, there is liquidity out there. And of course, we can get more into the PPP if there's questions on that. But the short answer for this slide is that voting of the owners would not necessarily be required if it's required under the documents because of the emergency powers. The final point here is how do we adopt these procedures? And so all the things that Jason's going to talk about in terms of occupancy, seating restrictions, and all that, and how the nuts and bolts of how to operate the restaurant, how do we implement this? And our recommendation is that you do so at a board meeting. We think it should be in the minutes, right? Because if you're going to open the facilities, there's some level of liability associated with that. There's liability with walking out your door every day, but there's some level of liability associated with that. And your charge is to take reasonable precautions in response to a known dangerous condition. And so all of the procedures and requirements that you implement, those are a check in the box or a notch in the column for reasonableness if there was ever litigation. And so the point here is that you want to be able to demonstrate that you made a fully informed decision when you implement those restrictions. And so what does that mean? It means making a decision by a board vote at an open meeting of the members. So how do emergency powers relate here? Emergency powers relate that you don't have to give full 48 hours notice of a board meeting to do this. You can give notice as practicable, the statute says. So if you only have 6 hours to make this decision before the restaurant opens, give 6 hours, do it anyway, because 6 hours is practicable in this context. And so you can point to the minutes someday if anyone ever challenged you didn't do enough, and you can list the precautions that you implemented at an open meeting after owners had their 3 minutes to tell you why it was a great idea or the worst idea ever, but ultimately you have the minutes to substantiate the board's vote to do that. And the emergency powers say that you don't have to give full 48 hours. And so if you're finding yourself facing an opening for Mother's Day and you don't have 48 hours to do this, then do whatever you can in terms of practicable and have a board meeting. We also know now that you can have small gatherings of people. It's discouraged, but the library, for example, can be open as long as it's not 25% occupancy. So maybe you start thinking about having hybrid board meetings where you do have a virtual platform. Maybe you also have a call-in number, or you have a room where you allow no more than 10 or 20 people to attend, spaced out, and where there's still a Zoom or a GoToMeeting facilitation so that owners can attend remotely if they don't want to attend in close proximity to others. So we're kind of shifting into that next world where we may be doing hybrid board meetings, but you can still give notice as practicable to implement these restrictions that we talk about today, or that might be appropriate specifically to your community. So that's emergency powers. We're going to know a lot more in the next 12 hours about how the governor views this.
Right, and it's a great point, Steve. I think we've been, chatting a lot with our board members and kind of guiding them that, especially with, closing down the facilities and then starting to reopen them, and with all of the, information flow coming, things are happening quickly. And so absolutely, I agree 100% with being able to, have a meeting when it's, urgent. But on the other side of that coin, we're also saying, look, don't hide under that and have an emergency meeting when it's really not an emergency. So you really want to make sure you're speaking with your management company and your attorney to make sure you're staying on the right side of right there. We do have a question that came in, and it kind of, as we're talking now about, what to do with opening up, the questions come from Ted, and he said, will you be covering association exposure to legal actions that could possibly be initiated by employees that are asked to return to work and then become infected with COVID? And from a non-legal standpoint, I can tell you, employee safety is the #1 concern for our team here at Castle. And we've had weekly calls with all of our property managers. We're making sure they have, the proper PPE. We're educating everybody about, wearing masks, doing social distancing. So from that end of it, you want to make sure, I think, that everybody's educated. But Steve, will you chat a little bit just about your thoughts on that from a liability standpoint?
Sure. So I think there's two things to talk about there. #1 is, well, who's the employer? Okay. So obviously, if you have management company that is employing the staff member, there is a relationship there that needs to be respected first in terms of how to address that issue. Or you might be employing the staff directly, in which case this becomes much more of a relevant issue. You obviously have, you have an obligation to provide a safe environment. You can't know for sure where this virus is. And so your obligation is to take reasonable precautions. There's risk associated with anything. And so the second part of that, which ties into it, is that there are now confirmations from insurance carriers that they do not intend on covering claims against associations and directors arising out of or related to the virus. They're going to use a biohazard exclusion in most policies to deny coverage. And so when you make a decision to open up and maybe you take less or more aggressive restrictions in how you're going to implement this, you need to think to yourself, well, because there's liability with anything that we do in life, the more precautions we take, the more quote unquote reasonable we'll be looking. And so it's possible there won't be insurance there for these types of claims. It doesn't mean that you won't be indemnified. Excuse me. The documents are still going to indemnify association directors and officers and all that stuff. But ultimately, the insurance may not be there. And so this may dictate how you make a decision on opening up and whether you want to be more conservative or less conservative. We're obviously telling people to be more conservative in this context. And so if you don't think that you can provide and implement reasonable precautions for staff, then maybe that's something to think about whether it's appropriate to open up in the first place. Okay. So we're not saying that lawsuits are going to go flying around. Obviously, you want to talk to your legal counsel about what is reasonable for you and what you can implement, and more importantly with your staff about what you can implement. But if there is that lawsuit, there is a question of whether insurance is going to be available. So maybe that dictates a more conservative approach to opening up and the precautions that you take.
Right. And I know this slide that we have up, we're talking about, what it literally looks like when you open up the restaurant or facility. And one of the questions that's come in, this is probably for Jason and Steve, maybe you can talk a little bit about it, Jason, when you go through this slide, is to determine occupancy, do we use the Florida Fire Prevention Code for each dining area? I think that question is relating to knowing how many people can actually come into the restaurant, if you guys could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. And Steve will probably have the legal side of it. I'll tell you the logical side of it. I would say that the number you're probably going to use is whatever your license says that you have occupancy for. That's the amount of people that you could safely serve in that building if there were a fire or some other type of emergency. So I think that would be the foundation of what you would look at. But also think as a framing for the conversation, and Steve hit on it a little bit, is that whatever those rules and numbers are, I look at it kind of like a speed limit. So just because the speed limit is 75 doesn't mean you have to go 75. You go a speed up to that until you feel comfortable. So if you feel comfortable at 60, go 60. If you feel comfortable at 75, go 75. So it's a matter of comfortability. And that 25% number, I know I saw a question on there, so I'll address this a little bit now. The 25% number, how did they arrive at that? They literally just said, like Steve said, what's the safest way for us to implement this with a very broad stroke decision? And what they said was, based on average occupancy, I'm sure there's an algorithm that was created to come up with it, but they said at 25%, at least you have the opportunity to create an environment in which social distancing can occur and you can manage it inside of that.
Great. On my end, with these points, the clients are asking, well, how can we better protect ourselves? And so in addition to the implementation of the distance and the service and the cleaning, in addition to all that, what are some of the things that we can do? Can we require people to sign a waiver before they can walk into the clubhouse and stuff like that? And so there's definitely debate on whether you can force somebody to sign a waiver before they use something that they're entitled to under their contract, under their covenants. But we do think that there's certainly room to work with signage. And we are telling clients that those signs should include at least 4 things. The first thing that we're telling people to include is a statement that says, despite the fact that we're cleaning more, we can't guarantee a virus or a germ-free environment. It's impossible. It's an invisible virus. Number 2, that you should exercise social distancing. And so in this context, this is very restaurant relevant, and Jason will get to some of those requirements of how we deal with that. But essentially, if you're not following those requirements, we may have to shut this thing down again. Number 3 would be to contact your healthcare professional before you use any of these amenities. You may have a condition that makes you more or less susceptible, and that goes into the thought-making and decision-making process. And then the final 4th point is use at your own risk, right? So I recognize this is not jumping out of an airplane, but when you jump out of an airplane, you sign a piece of paper that doesn't say, go ahead and be negligent, company. It says, I recognize that jumping out of a plane is dangerous stuff, and I might get hurt doing this. And so the same thing goes here, which you want people to acknowledge that there might be germs and virus in this room. We can't guarantee, although we're cleaning more. Number 2, that you should talk to your doctor before you go in there. Number 3, you should be maintaining CDC recommendations. And even all those things considered, when you walk through the threshold of the building, you're assuming the risk of doing that with those 3 things in mind. And so those signs, we believe, should be posted prominently before you walk in. And if you are going to venture into the world of having people sign things before they walk in, those are the types of things you want them to acknowledge before you try and do that.
Right, great. And then Jason, can you maybe just walk us through a little bit of what, some of the steps are that we would take when we're going to open up? And some of the questions, I'm going to kind of summarize a couple of them together because I think you'll touch on it, Jason, when you kind of walk us through the opening. But some of them are talking about, again, what percentage, like how do we know how many people we can have inside? Thoughts on partial versus full, opening up partially versus fully, and determining staffing and inventory needs for the reopening. Maybe you can touch on a couple of those.
Sure. So first we'll talk about kind of how to set your restaurant up, since that's kind of where Steve left off, and the slide that's in front of you now. So the first thing you got to remember is that you're setting up your restaurant based on your restaurant. Everything that's being done by the federal government right now, by the local, state, and governments, and everybody else, we are in uncharted territory. So everybody's literally inventing the rules as we go. So to throw a blanket statement out there and say, everybody do A and you'll be fine, it's just not necessarily true. Some of you have little cafes that seat 10 people at a bar top. Some of you have 30, 40 tables in a restaurant. Some of you have giant pools. So there's not a one size fits all for everything. Our responsibility from food and beverage is to create an environment that at least allows for the biggest potential of success. And the way that you do that is by setting yourself up for success ahead of time. So think about if it were, well, Mother's Day is coming. In a traditional year, in most restaurants, Mother's Day would be one of the biggest days of the year. Yeah. Most people take reservations. There's hundreds of people coming in. And so you set your restaurant accordingly. If you know you have 15 parties of 6 that are coming in between 3 and 4, you would have those tables already set up for 6 people so that you're not struggling when the thing arrives. So you don't want to be putting out fires as they're popping up. You want to be maintaining the fire before it becomes one. And so the way that you would do that in the slide that you see in front of you, and again, we're just kind of creating an environment as we go. So if you want to maintain a 6-foot distance, just create an atmosphere that has a 6-foot distance in it. So I would say start with, if you have 10 tables, try to spread them all out 6 feet apart. And if that doesn't work, start removing tables until you can get them 6 feet out. We have several restaurants that we looked at a 25% capacity and we said, okay, how many seats is that? And then we pulled out the seats and then we said, now let's make the table 6 feet apart. That's the best way to do that. One of the things that I recommend, because a lot of what we're doing is we're creating a mentally safe atmosphere for people to enjoy themselves as well. So it's similar to having having a gate on top of a 90-story building. Well, it's not going to stop you from climbing over, but it gives you the illusion that there's a safety mechanism there and that people are being responsible for your safety. So when you put these tables 6 feet apart, what I recommended was go to Ace Hardware or any hardware store really, and you can they make duct tape now in about 3,000 different colors, and get the brightest, most obnoxious tape that you can find and put those tables in a place and then make a giant X on the floor so that is symbolic of where that 6-foot radius is. Now, the entire world can't stand at 6-foot radius around every single person on the planet. We wouldn't fit. It just doesn't work that way. So there's a question that's going to pop up, and I've seen it happen, I think 3 times in our question list today, about parties of 10. And not to jump ahead, but this is a big component of that. So if you think about who is in that party of 10, most of the time it's friends and family. Well, if you've been in your house, I'm fairly certain that not everybody in your house is staying 6 feet apart. You've been in the same house with these people for months and months and months. So the idea of you sitting at a table together isn't changing that dynamic at all. That number at 10 was set because it may push you beyond the 25% hurdle and eliminate other people from coming into your building. But if people come in and Fiona and I are sitting at one table and Steve and his wife are sitting at another table and we decide we want to have lunch together, those 2 tables may come together, then we would want to react by moving everything else around them out by 6 foot. There's other places in your restaurant that will come into question as well, like your bar. If you have a bar in your restaurant, what I've suggested to everybody is to remove the bar stools. The reason that you sit at a bar is because you want to socially engage with people. And so if you're sitting at a bar and there's nobody within 6 feet of you, it defeats the whole purpose of sitting at the bar. So take the bar stools out, just eliminate it from the conversation. And that way you don't have to go back and fight that problem later on. We've created some signage for you in there as well. If you haven't seen the reopen plan, let me know and you can send it to that info email, and I'll respond and drop it out to you. And a lot of the things that you are creating anxiety over in your restaurants in the opening, we address it in there. But like Steve said, it's an invisible virus. We cannot guarantee that is going to happen. And these are guidelines. So 25% is 25. Even if you open to the public, which that's going to be on an association by association basis. I know it was an early question, but the same rules would apply. So just because you shut the public out doesn't guarantee the safety of the residents inside. right? They're still people. It's an unknown virus. It's spreading amongst everybody on the planet, or could. So if you decide to open to the public, the same rules still apply. So you would still keep people 6 feet apart. You would stay at a 25% occupancy, and that's just kind of how it would work.
Great. And one of the questions that came in too was from Gary. He says, you know, how do you enforce the rules? And I think that's a great conversation that we should have, because Steve kind of touched on it earlier. You can't just stick your head in the sand and say, well, I'm not going to look, you know, there's a group of 30 over there.
Right.
That's not, I don't think that's reasonable. And
Sure.
Steve, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what we're saying to people is, look, you've got to set the rules up. You've got to be reasonable about how you manage it. And all of those things Jason just mentioned, really that's training, right? That's talking to the restaurant team. It's talking through potential scenarios before they happen. It's thinking about, you know, do we do reservations? You know, how do we handle people as they're walking in? You know, even depending on the setup of your restaurant, you may need that 6-foot tape on the floor outside the restaurant. So that if people are walking in, they're waiting for a table, they're, you know, spaced out. But if people are ignoring you, we talked about the scenario yesterday of if you do have a party of 10 and, you know, Jim and Sally walk by who've been out of town for 3 weeks and they see that party of 10 and say, hey, great. And they go, oh, pull up a chair. Well, you know, politely, you would want the server to say, no, I'm really sorry. And, you know, we need to keep it to a group of 10. We're happy to get you a table over here. You know, Jim and Sally at 6 feet away and you guys can still, you know, chat kind of thing. Steve, any comments on that?
Yeah, it's about knowing what you can do and what you can do well. Whenever you assume an obligation, a duty comes along with that. And that duty is to reasonably and prudently carry it through. And so if you're going to open up and you're going to implement these rules that you believe are necessary or a really good idea to protect people, you're giving the impression that you are doing this to protect people. And if you put your head in the sand when you see lots of violations going on of those rules, you know, maybe you don't want the server running over and telling people they're going to get, you know, criminal sanctions against them by violating this rule. Maybe you don't want that. You probably don't want that. Actually, I would recommend you don't do that. But in the same token, how do we address this? And so if the board is cognizant of the inability practically to enforce these types of restrictions, maybe you have to think to yourself, should we be shutting this thing down again because people can't follow the rules?
Right.
And so knowing what you can implement, knowing what you can do well, you know, the example that everyone's asking right now is, you know, should we be taking temperatures of people walking in? Should we be doing travel history inquiries? Should we be putting thermal cameras at the door to see if anyone has temperature? And I would argue—
Let's set the record straight on that, Steve, please.
What's that?
I said, let's set the record straight on that. That's a great point to bring up.
Yeah, and we're getting these questions all over. And the answer is that you shouldn't do this. And why? Not because you don't have great intentions in wanting to do it, but because you're not trained for this. You're going to screw it up, right? Anybody would, right? Our boards and our management team, like, you're not trained medical professionals. And when you give the impression that you are taking temperatures to keep people out with a fever, there's a good chance that you're going to either misuse the equipment or miss somebody, or that's not being part of your job description, not do it well. And when someone comes in with that fever, now all of a sudden you're falling asleep, and now someone claims that they were coughing at the table next to me and I came down with the virus 14 days later and that's the only place I went. Therefore, I'm sure I got it at the restaurant from that person with the cough. And the association had a rule that said no one with fevers came in. Clearly, they had a fever. They were wiping their forehead. Now I'm going to sue the association. Now the association may not have insurance because it's related to her coming out of coronavirus. Now everyone's fighting over how this person got the virus, which is an impossible thing to prove one way or the other. So you can see how this goes downhill really quickly. So the logic here is know what you can do, know what you can do well, do it prudently, follow through on it. And if you find yourself practically unable to carry these things through, either scale back or think about shutting down because of that potential exposure.
Yep, I would agree with all that.
And then Jason, we had can you speak a little bit? We had a question, and I'm sorry, I'm going like this, guys. I have another screen open, so I'm reading the questions as they're coming in. We talked about the 25% capacity for inside, but the question is about outside. So is there a limit on outside dining? Do you want to speak to that, Jason, a little bit?
Sure, I'll give you my my food and beverage take on it, and then Steve may have some legalities that he wants to pepper in there as well. So it is my understanding, the way that I read it, that the 25% and the 6 foot space, the 6 foot spacing exists no matter where your service areas are. However, the 25% is talking about the inside of your building, because the most vulnerable you are to the virus, if you're vulnerable at all, is when you're in a confined space, because there's nowhere for all of this stuff to go. If you're outside, you're outside. So if you have, for example, we have restaurants that they seat 60 people inside, and then they've got a little patio that seats 10 or 15 people, but it also happens to be connected to a pool area. Well, in theory, you could recreate your dining room in the pool area, spacing those things 6 feet apart, and the same rules would maintain, but there's no definitive walls on the outside of that. So that 25% rule, I believe is kind of, I don't want to say null and void, but it becomes something that you don't necessarily deal with. And as a matter of fact, a lot of restaurateurs now are talking about the wave of the future will be, you'll see restaurants with much smaller interior dining rooms and a bigger footprint on the outside, because they'll be able to safely seat more people there. And again, the idea is not to put the fire out, but to avoid striking the match to begin with. And so in those types of environments, it makes things much, much easier if you do it outside.
That's correct, Jason. Yeah, the order actually says that 25% is for the indoor capacity. And it says, in addition, outdoor seating is permissible with appropriate social distancing. And so it's just basically, can you facilitate the social distancing requirement? And now I think you're seeing restaurants petition to use parking lots for restaurants as well, because that's the place to go.
Sure.
Yeah. And the only thing I'd add on that with those are associations that do have the pools and then the kitchen facility close by. Just be careful with the pool rules, as far as from the health department, you can't have food too close to the pool. So you don't want your table, right on top of the pool, basically. So just keep that in mind as well. It does get a little tricky.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing you'd want to be careful of, and we can talk more about this in a one-on-one scenario if you'd like, and by all means, feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about this stuff, and I'll help you. Is you got to watch your liquor license as well. So if you're recreating a dining room outside and on the outskirts of your building, which is fine, but know where that limitation is. Now, early on, they came out and said, sell alcohol to go out of your building, whatever it was, because they were trying to keep the population as calm as possible and allow them as many freedoms as they could. I don't necessarily recommend that, because I think you walk into some dangerous territory, but know what that limitation is. And again, just don't strike the match. Don't worry about putting the fire out. Just don't allow it to become a fire to begin with.
Okay, great. So we have a couple of questions. I'm just going to take a quick break here because the questions are starting to pile up a little bit. I'm not going in any particular order, but we've got one from Richard. It says, can a high-rise condo with a gated community have a higher level of restrictions for visitors, non-essential service providers, etc., than the overall gated community? So I can tell you, Richard, and certainly Steve can jump in, the answer in my mind is yes, because obviously, in an open air HOA, there's less, contact, less cleaning, etc. So generally, we've seen as a rule in the high-rise condos where you've got interior hallways, etc., there have been more restrictions in those buildings because the living conditions are much more closed quarters versus, a large-scale HOA where there isn't even a gate. Steve, anything to add on that one?
No, that's exactly correct. I guess maybe the broader issue there is that you might be able to get through the outside gate because the master association has a certain number of restrictions. But then when they get to your building, you could have more restrictive restrictions to allow access. So while they might be able to get through the gate in some circumstances, you could have more restrictive rules on access at that point.
Okay, and then we had a question come in from Marty. He says, if the current rule says groups no larger than, and I don't have the number, I think he's saying 10, how can you justify larger numbers in restaurants and outside dining? And Steve, you want to speak to that from legal? I believe that's the way the order is written.
So the question is, how do you justify it? Well, the governor says that you can have parties of no more than 10. And so I'm not saying that mirrors social distancing exactly. It doesn't really mirror it at all, but it is permissible. So there is a way of facilitating the parties of no more than 10 and then having those parties be separated by at least 6 feet. And that's what Jason was alluding to earlier with the table placements and tables coming together. So it's allowed.
Yeah. So, and I think, Marty, that the key there is, so the guidance from the governor was for restaurants inside, you cannot exceed, is it 25%, gentlemen, of
Yep.
the, whatever your license says you can have. So, but again, once you're inside the restaurant, you've got that 25%. To Steve's point, you've got to keep it to groups of 10, and they must be socially distanced. So hopefully, Marty, that clarifies for you.
Right. And there's ways also that you can manage into that as well. And again, I started off the conversation by saying the speed limit may be 75. That doesn't mandate that you have to go 75. So if you're really concerned about parties of 10 or more, just restrict your restaurant to 8. Right? I mean, you can set your own guidelines and say, you know, just because the governor said I can go up to 10 doesn't mean I have to go up to 10. So maybe you set your own parameter at 8, and that helps you eliminate some of that hurdle. And you just explain to guests, listen, we're not taking parties of 8 or more because of, you know, the rules and regulations and our ability to social distance. And you'd be surprised if you communicate properly to the general public how willing they are to follow that guideline. But you got to tell them up front. You can't wait until 30 people are at a table and say, didn't you read the sign in the bathroom that said 8 people? And then blame them for it. So the idea is that you set yourself up for success before it ever happens.
That's a great point.
Okay. And then Jason, so I think that kind of covers number 2 on the slide about, you know, reopening. So we've talked about, you know, sort of thinking about size and how quickly you're going to open. Talk to us a little bit, Jason, about the vendors and delivery schedules and things like that.
Sure. So some of you have worked with me and some of you haven't yet, but we have a broadline vendor that's called Cheney. All of you deal with one. So you could have Cisco, you could have US Foods, whomever that would be. My first suggestion is reach out to all of your vendors and talk to them about what their current delivery schedule is. Because prior to coronavirus, you may have gotten your major deliveries on Tuesdays and Thursdays religiously and all before 8 a.m. However, the coronavirus is impacting their business almost in the same way that it is ours. And by what I mean by that is certain people aren't allowed to come to work. They can only have a certain amount of people in their buildings. You know, there are certain rules and regulations that apply to their business just like it does ours. So you may get ready to open thinking you're going to get deliveries on Tuesdays and Thursdays before 8 a.m. only to find out that your now vendor can only deliver you on Wednesdays, and it's just going to happen whenever it happens. So it's important that you know that before you try to build your business around that. And every vendor will be able to tell you that, you know, exactly when that's going to happen, and your order time may change. You may have already had those conversations, but that's where you want to start. And then number 2, we talked a little bit about don't overestimate the size of your reopening. So we've had a few restaurants that have reopened in stages, meaning we were totally closed and now we're doing pickup and carry out. And it started off with a bang, right? Because everybody's been confined into their house for, you know, however long that's been. And now we've given them the keys to Disneyland, and everybody shows up on the first day and we're like, oh my gosh, I did $2,000 on the first day. And so you start trying to bring back all these people and place all these orders. And the next day goes from 2,000 to 1,500 down to 1,000, down to 500, down to 400, because the new cafe smell has worn off of the event and it's getting down to some realistic numbers. So don't overestimate what that's going to look like in our heads, because we deal with residents every day. We think the moment that we turn this light switch on and send out that email, that all 1,200 residents or however many people live in your community or your building are going to be lined up outside your door, and it's going to be this mass confusion on how you deal with it. And the reality is that's just not true. So don't overestimate, don't underestimate, but don't overestimate. The third thing on there is don't try to be all things to all people. Again, just because you're reopening doesn't mean you have to open with your entire menu. So if you do 300 items on your menu, you can't do 300 items for 4 people a day and not knowing what they're going to order, and only do it with 3 associates because you've got to practice social distancing in your building. You just can't execute it. So you wind up creating a giant mess for yourself, and it's something that you could have controlled. So what I'm recommending to people is don't be all things to all people. Be the things that you can control. So maybe it's 3 salads and a couple of entrees. Maybe it's just cold sandwiches and soup. The idea that you're opening, giving them the ability to get out of their house and experience something different and interact with other human beings other than the 5 people that have been in their house, is really what those people are looking for. So I know you may have the most delicious stuffed salmon dish on the planet, but it doesn't mean that you can execute it every day, not in this environment. You'll grow back into that. but be smart and control your environment. The next thing is review your menu and what you're offering. And we talked about that a little bit. So if you are, and we have several of them, I've been to a lot of them, and your food offerings are wonderful. But in an environment like this, you just can't say, I'm gonna serve fresh salmon every day, because number one, you have to buy that case of fresh salmon, which costs you $400 and it's 35 pieces. Well, if you don't sell all of that fresh salmon in 3 days, you just threw away $300 and 35 pieces of salmon. So you can't necessarily execute that. So be smart in what you're offering. I would recommend staying in a box for meats that maybe you have a frozen product that you thaw and serve, whether it's burgers, chicken, steak, whatever that looks like in your particular menu and your offerings. And then stay with very specific fresh products. So salads and tomatoes and things like that, stuff that you can buy in smaller quantities, because those numbers are going to shift on you on a daily basis, and you're going to wind up creating a lot more waste in terms of labor and product than you do in terms of profit. Now, I've dealt with a lot of restaurants in our system, and one of the things that I find in every single one I go into, and whether you believe it or not, I'm telling you it's the truth. So you probably have about 3 times more product in your buildings than you actually use on a daily basis or a weekly basis. And since coronavirus, all of that stuff has now gone bad, and it's probably gone, and your coolers are pretty much empty with the exception of some frozen product. Recognize how much of that stuff you threw away, and then realize that you probably had 4 or 5 times more product than you actually needed. If you can get 2 to 3 deliveries a week, bring in small amounts. It's always better to prep less more often than it is to say, well, I'm going to only prep on Tuesday because, Carl, my prep guy, works on Tuesday, and so therefore we make everything for the whole week. You're actually creating waste, and you're paying somebody to do it. So know what your usage is, and get in that group. Now's a great time to figure it out and get away from the, well, on every week I just order 4 cases of this and 4 cases of that, because that's what I've always done. It doesn't necessarily work. It's just putting product on your shelves, collecting dust instead of in the bank collecting interest.
Great. Thanks, Jason. We have a couple of questions that came in, so we're getting close. We're about 10:50, so I'm going to try to jump to a couple of questions. They may be a little off topic, but I want to address them. One came in from Charlene on PPP funding, and she said, we heard the money is gone. We called our bank. They said they're no longer processing applications. How and should we still apply? Thinking that we can't predict the future of our revenue continuing to come in as people may begin to feel the pinch of loss of income, etc. Steve, any thoughts on that one?
Well, the first thing is you have to apply in the first place through the bank with your operating accounts. So that is going to be your contact person, and whether they'll even take the application in the first place. I think you're hearing whispers of additional phases of making small business loans available. Marco Rubio's Twitter account is actually a great source of information for the small business stuff. He's putting updates all the time about, is there more money becoming available? And so assuming that you are eligible, then you got to talk to your local lender with your operating accounts. And that's really where the decision is being made. The underwriting is actually, the first 2 phases of underwriting are at the local bank before it actually goes to the federal government. So if you can't get past those first 2 levels of underwriting, you're not going to even get into the game, so to speak. So speak with that person, and they're going to have their ears to the ground a little bit better than most about if there's another wave of funding coming up.
Okay, great. And then we had a question, let's see, from Marty. He says, what is the HOA's responsibility in monitoring residents' activities at the opened amenities? So we've chatted a little bit about that. I think Marty's more asking maybe more about like the pool area and things like that. Any thoughts on that, Steve?
Yeah, well, first, it depends what county you're in, is the first answer. So some counties require full-time supervision of the pool if you're going to keep it open. So it says you have to have, I think this is Palm Beach County, you have to have someone watching the pool the whole time to make sure that there is social distancing being exercised. The other issue is the bathroom. Many of communities say, we want to open the bathroom, we want to open the pool, but we don't want to open the bathroom. But the Department of Health is saying that you have to have the bathroom open if you're going to open the pool. And so are we going to have the staffing level to keep the bathroom clean with the frequency that we want so that people have a place to go instead of the pool for the restroom? So the answer is that, again, you can't put your head in the sand. If you're going to require social distancing as a part of being able to use the amenity, you need to have some increased frequency of checking. You can't just adopt the rule saying stay 6 feet apart and then ignore what's going on, because if people are ignoring it and you know they're ignoring it, or you should know they're ignoring it, then that's a negligence potentially. So the point here is that you should have some increased frequency, whether it's going from once an hour to twice an hour, or whether it's going to once an hour from nothing. All of that is, again, a check on a notch in the column of prudently carrying out the restrictions that you're implementing. So if you're going to require social distancing, which you should, I think there's some level of observation that must go on so that you can say we're enforcing the rule, or we have to shut down the pool because people can't follow the rule. And depending on what county you're in, there may be a requirement to have full-time supervision. I'm not aware of that in Lee, Collier, or Charlotte, but on the East Coast, and I know particularly Palm Beach, that is currently a requirement.
Yeah, and it's a great point, Steve, on the pools. You must check by county, because I know some also have a specific restriction in there saying you can reopen your pool. As you mentioned, some say you have to have staff. Others will tell you exactly based on your bathing load, whether it's, you've got to cut that by 50%, and that includes, in some counties, I've seen it specifically say that includes the pool and the pool deck. Well, that can be a big area. And if your pool normally holds, 50 and now you can only have 25, you better have a mechanism to keep to that 25, right? And to your point, we don't want any heads in the sand. As much as that would be an easy route, that's not the route we want you to take. We had another question that came in, and I'm trying to find it, so bear with me. They were asking about, it sounds like they're doing, kind of like potlucks and people bringing food, etc., maybe to the clubhouse. Any, let's see. Yeah, I think that was the question. That they're doing potlucks and they're wanting to know, legally if that's something that they can do for food sharing in communities, spaghetti dinners, etc. Liability for that food prepared in the kitchen. Any thoughts on that one?
Well, first of all, my thought is I love potlucks. So the church potlucks are one of my favorite things. Secondly is that the question at the end hinted at this is some sort of providing food for others as opposed to a private gathering. If we're talking about a purely private gathering where it's an invitation only, you're just kind of huddling at the pool deck as opposed to at a house, I think it's the same thing as going to play pickleball or tennis, right? Social distancing, groups no more than 10. The association, if they're aware of it, they should be cleaning more. It doesn't sound like the association would be sponsoring it. But if the association is sponsoring people bringing in food for the purpose of redistributing it to other people as kind of like an invitation, then I think that goes a little bit more into Jason's wheelhouse in terms of you probably need to take some precautions on the sanitation side, because you're effectively feeding people at that point. It's the same thing as making it in your restaurant.
Well, and I'll make a comment on that before we turn it over to Jason, because I did want him to cover this slide on sanitation before we have to wrap up. But I want to be clear with everybody. What's allowed is for restaurants to reopen, right? That is different than, I know in a lot of the large scale HOAs and even in the towers, they'll have like a potluck for everyone brings something and come down to the community room and, everybody shares everything. That's great. But the rule of 10 here still applies, and you're not a restaurant. Like, your community room is not a restaurant. So you can't go with the 25% rule. Do you follow what I'm saying there? So if your club facility, seats 300 people, that's not a restaurant. The 25% doesn't apply. Steve, do you agree with that?
In a way, I think it applies maybe in the other section, right? Museums, libraries can open now with up to 25%. So maybe that's the applicable standard, and it's still the same standard. But you're correct. No, it's not a restaurant in that context, except that you're providing the same service, which is why this sanitation stuff comes back into play.
Yeah. So Jason, walk us through.
Yeah, I would add just a little word of caution in there as well. So your licensing covers how you operate with food. So a lot of that is also going to depend on location. So if they're saying, hey, we're going to do a potluck and we want to do it at the cafe or at the restaurant or on the patio of the cafe, once that happens, you are the responsible vendor for that. You become liable for what happens inside of that. So if they bring all that food on there and you're providing the plates, the silverware, and all that stuff, it's our job hygienically as well as sanitation to manage that product, just as we would if it was our own. And so that kind of takes us into hygiene and cleaning for your staff and your facility. And I'm assuming that's where you wanted me to go with that, Fiona?
Yes, please.
Okay. And I've been saying this for a while, in the midst of all the craziness for the coronavirus, the restaurant business is actually built for this. So if you are actually following your current policies and procedures and sanitation and health department regulations and all those things, you're already accomplishing about 85 to 90% of what is necessary in order to create a safe environment. So if our associates are washing their hands at least once an hour and they're changing their gloves between projects and a minimum of twice per hour, and you're providing sanitation or sanitary cleaning for all your tables and chairs and all of that type of stuff. If you're following all that stuff and that's a part of your daily routine, you're already doing a lot of those things. We've added some additional layers so that we can be even more safe, but it's really just doing more of what we normally do more often. So in the reopen plan that, like I said, if you don't have it, let me know. I'll be happy to send it out, and maybe we'll just blanket send it out to everybody that was on this call today so that you have it. There's some very specific things in there that we talk about, and we talk about how to receive orders from vendors and a few more steps that you want to take, like unload everything off the truck, allow it to sit in the sunshine for 30 to 45 minutes. That helps eliminate some of the virus. Then when possible, as you take it in, take things out of the box. And put them on a cart and take them in and then load them onto the shelves because that eliminates the people that have touched that box before it comes into your building. So it's a matter of understanding the supply chain and how that works. And then bring it in and then wipe it down. If it's in a bottle, wipe it down with a sanitary towel before you put it on the shelf. So doing those types of things are obviously going to be helpful, but really cleaning and clearing the tables is the biggest part. Make sure your dish machines, if they're a high temp machine, that they actually reach that high temperature at 180 degrees. If they're a low temp machine, make sure that you actually have the chemicals that do that. So the restaurant business is really built to be safe in this environment. It's just a matter of exercising those things. So if yesterday you were open and your associates didn't wear gloves or wipe down tables, you can hang 1,000 signs if you want to. It's not going to happen. You're going to have to enforce that rule, and it's something that you should be doing every day anyway. So wash your hands, change your gloves, don't pick your nose, don't run your fingers through your hair. There were several questions in there about how do we engage social distancing if you're going to open up the kitchen and there's a grill cook and a fry cook and a line cook and 3 servers. How do we keep them 6 feet apart? Well, you don't. It's almost impossible. But the idea being that those people are in constant motion. So they're not standing next to each other for 3-4 hours at a time, 2 feet away and they're exchanging breath and all those types of things. They're passing each other within that 6-foot barrier, but we just don't allow them to congregate and stand on the line and everybody eat soup and crackers like you would normally do when you're in a slow period. So you kind of break them up a little bit. And then as the shift is moving, those people are moving throughout the building, just like if people are passing through a door. Well, unless your door is 12 foot wide, you can't create a 6-foot barrier between people as they exit your building. It's just not going to happen. But the idea is that you've set up an environment where they're not going to be in that moment in time for a long period of time. It's going to be fleeting and they're going to move, and that's going to be it.
All right, great. Well, we've come basically to 11 o'clock. Look at that. The time went super fast. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I think just to wrap it up, the key here is communication. It's something we have talked about, continually through this process. The more that you can, first of all, communicate from a site standpoint. So you as the board communicating with your management team, talking about the scenarios before they happen, putting a written plan together, walking through the scenarios again and again, and continue to connive, right? Never-ending improvement as you're going along. Then making sure you're communicating to the residents, e-blast, let them know what the process is going to be, when you open up for to-go orders or when you're going to open up the restaurant altogether. Give them some of that information and give them the why behind, the rules that you've implemented so that they can hopefully understand. And then, you know, as they're coming to the restaurant, maybe have those, you know, rules posted. And again, explaining the why so that people understand that you're trying to do the right thing. I'm sure a lot of you feel like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't in a lot of these situations. Some people want you to keep everything closed. Others want you to keep everything open. So, you know, hang in there. We appreciate all that you are doing as board members. Definitely email us at info@castlegroup.com. We'd be happy to answer additional questions. Jason can reach out to you one-on-one, and we can get our reopening plan to you if you do want it. Steve, I'll turn it over to you. Anything you'd like to say before we sign off?
No, I just really appreciate the opportunity. It's a great topic. I know there's a lot of HOAs and condos that have food, and it's while that's a minority of the ones in the state, it's a great topic to discuss. And I think there's a lot of good information shared today.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of Jason and I, thanks everybody. We really appreciate your time today. Enjoy a fabulous weekend. And for all the mothers out there, happy Mother's Day.